Story 1. The Last Train. This story comes from a woman I'll call Nina. She's in her late 20s, lives in Chicago, and at the time this happened she was 25 and working as a server at a restaurant in the city that kept late hours. She got off work most nights between midnight and 1 a.m. and took the L home, the elevated train system that runs through Chicago and keeps reduced service through the night. She'd done the commute hundreds of times. She knew which cars to stand in, which stations to avoid lingering in, all the small navigational instincts you develop when you commute alone at night in a major city. She was not naive about it. She was careful in the specific, practiced way that women who work late shifts in cities become careful. She said the night this happened was a Thursday in November. She got off work at 12:45 a.m., walked the 3 blocks to the station, went through the turnstile and went up to the platform. The platform was mostly empty, one other person at the far end, a man in a work jacket who got on the first train that came and wasn't going her direction. Then she was alone on the platform. She said she didn't think anything of it. Alone on a late-night L platform in November was just the commute. She stood near the middle of the platform where the lighting was best, had her phone in her hand, waited. The train came about 8 minutes later. She got on. The car she entered had 3 other people in it, a woman asleep against the window, 2 men sitting separately who both appeared to be heading home from somewhere. She sat toward the middle of the car, put her earbuds in one ear. She always kept one ear free on late trains, and settled in for the 20-minute ride. She said the train made its first stop and nobody got on or off in her car. Second stop, same. Third stop, the woman who'd been asleep gathered herself and got off. Now it was Nina and the 2 men. She said she became aware of one of the men at the 4th stop. Not because he did anything. She said the word she keeps coming back to is oriented. He oriented toward her. Not visibly, not overtly. He didn't move or speak or look directly at her. But she said something in his posture shifted at the 4th stop in a way that she registered without being able to articulate. The angle of his attention changed. He was now aware of her in a way he hadn't been before or was choosing to make known in a way he hadn't before. She said women who travel alone at night know this feeling. She said it's not paranoia. It's pattern recognition built from experience. She said she's felt it before and been wrong, and she's felt it before and been right, and she knew the difference between the two, and this felt like the second kind. She looked at her phone. 2 more stops until hers. At the 5th stop, the other man, the one she hadn't been watching, got off. Now it was her and the 1 man. She said she was watching him peripherally. He still hadn't done anything. He was sitting 4 rows ahead of her, facing forward, not looking at her. But she said the quality of his stillness was wrong. It was the stillness of someone performing stillness. Deliberate, managed. Her stop was next. She said she made a decision. She didn't get off at her stop. She stayed on. She said this is a thing women learn. If you're not sure, don't lead someone to where you live. Stay on. Get off somewhere public. Figure it out from there. Her stop came and went. She stayed in her seat. The man got off at her stop. She watched through the window as the train pulled away. He was on the platform. He wasn't looking at the train. He was standing on the platform, and she could see, in the 2 or 3 seconds before the train curved away, that he wasn't oriented toward the exit. He was standing still on the platform, facing the direction the train had gone. She rode 2 more stops, got off at a station she didn't usually use, came up to street level and stood in the light of a 24-hour convenience store and called her roommate and talked to her while she waited for a rideshare. She said the rideshare took 11 minutes, and she spent those 11 minutes in the lit doorway of the convenience store with her phone at her ear and her back to the wall. She got home fine. Her roommate was awake when she got in. She said she sat at the kitchen table, and her hands started shaking about 20 minutes after she got home, the way they do when the adrenaline leaves. She said the story isn't over there. She said the reason she sent it to me is what happened 3 days later. She was at the same station, same time, roughly 1 a.m. after a shift. She was going through the turnstile when she noticed a piece of paper taped to the support pillar next to the fare machines. A printed flyer. The kind community members put up, community boards post, that you see everywhere in cities and mostly don't look at. She looked at this one because of the photograph. The flyer was from a neighborhood safety organization. It was alerting residents in the area to a person of concern, not a wanted criminal, not a formal police bulletin, but a community warning about an individual who had been reported multiple times for following women from late-night L trains to their homes. The flyer described the behavior and asked anyone with information to contact a number. The photograph on the flyer was a security camera still. Grainy, a man on a train platform. She said she stood at the turnstile and looked at that photograph for a long time. She said she's not going to say it was definitely the same man. The image was grainy, and she'd only seen him peripherally in a moving train at night. She said she can't make a definitive identification. She said she called the number on the flyer anyway. She told them about Thursday night. She gave them the train line, the time, the stop where the man had gotten off. She said the person she spoke to was from the neighborhood organization, not law enforcement, and they were grateful and said they'd pass it along. She said she doesn't know what came of it. She said she thinks about the decision she made at her stop, the decision to stay on the train. She said she makes that decision in about 3 seconds based on a feeling she couldn't have explained to anyone at the time. She said if she'd gotten off at her stop the way she always did, he would have followed her the 2 blocks to her building. She knows that the way she knows certain things that she can't fully defend logically, but that sit in her with complete certainty. She said she takes ride shares home now. Every night, no exceptions. She said it's expensive and she said she doesn't care. She said 3 seconds, and a feeling she couldn't explain. She said that's the whole thing. That's what she wants people to hear. Story 2. The parking structure. This story comes from a man I'll call Derek. He's in his early 30s, lives in Los Angeles. And at the time this happened, he was working late nights at a post-production company in Hollywood. The kind of work that keeps you in a dark room staring at a screen until 2 or 3 a.m., because that's when the deadline is, and the deadline doesn't negotiate. He parked in a structure 2 blocks from his office. A public structure, 7 stories, the kind of utilitarian concrete situation that exists in every city center. He'd parked there for almost a year. He knew the rhythms of it, busy during the day, quiet at night, the security booth on the ground floor that was staffed during business hours and unstaffed after 8. He'd walked through that structure alone at night more times than he could count. He said it was a Wednesday in July when things went wrong. He wrapped up around 2:30 a.m., packed his bag, walked the 2 blocks to the structure, took the elevator to the 4th floor where he'd parked that morning, got out. The 4th floor was empty except for his car and 2 others, a sedan near the elevator and an SUV near the stairwell door at the far end. Neither of them had been there when he'd arrived that morning, which meant other people were in the building working late somewhere. He didn't think about this. He walked toward his car. He was about halfway across the floor when he heard the stairwell door open. He said he glanced toward it automatically. The stairwell door was at the far end of the floor, maybe 60 feet from where he was standing. It was propped open. Not by a person, by what appeared to be a folded piece of cardboard wedged at the base. The door was open several inches, and he could see the dark of the stairwell through the gap. He said he looked at it for a moment. A propped stairwell door was nothing. Building staff did it sometimes. People propped them for ventilation or convenience. He looked away and kept walking toward his car. Then he heard something from the stairwell. A voice, low. He said it wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it had the quality of someone speaking rather than the ambient sounds of a building at night, coming from the stairwell, through the propped door. He stopped walking. He said he stood there and listened. The voice continued low, even, the cadence of someone speaking in a normal conversational tone. Just one voice. Not a phone call. He said it didn't have the rhythm of someone talking into a phone where there are pauses for the other person. It was continuous. One voice talking steadily in the dark stairwell at 2:30 a.m. He said he stood there and had a specific and clear thought, which was, "Who is that talking to?" He said the thought arrived with an accompanying physical response. His body understood the answer before his brain caught up. The voice was talking steadily, and there was no one answering, and that meant it was either a phone call with a rhythm he was misreading, or it was someone talking to themselves, or it was something else. He said none of those options felt good. He kept moving to his car, quickly now. He got his keys out while he was still walking. Another thing you learn, have your keys ready and hit the unlock button. The car beeped. Lights flashed. The voice from the stairwell stopped. He said the sudden silence after the voice stopped was worse than the voice. He said he was at his car door, and he got in and locked it and sat for a moment before starting the engine. And in that moment, the stairwell door pushed open further. Not all the way. A few more inches, beyond what the cardboard prop would account for, pushed from the inside. He said he could see the gap. He could see the dark of the stairwell through the wider gap. He could not see anyone in the gap. He started the car and drove down the ramp and out of the structure without looking back. He sat in his car on the street outside for a moment before pulling into traffic. He said he was deciding whether to call someone. He decided against it because he didn't know what he would say. A voice in a stairwell and a door opening weren't a crime and didn't constitute an emergency. He drove home. He said the thing that bothers him most in retrospect is the timing of the voice stopping. His car beeping when he unlocked it, that sound, that specific sound in a concrete parking structure, carries. It echoes. Whatever was in that stairwell heard his car unlock and stop talking. He said it knew he was there. He said it had been in that stairwell listening to him walk across the concrete floor, and it had been talking to itself, to someone, to something. And when his car announced his location, it went quiet. He said he's thought about why it went quiet, whether quiet was preparation, whether quiet was caution, whether the door pushing open further was accident or intention. He said he transferred his parking to a structure closer to his building 2 days later. He said the new structure has an attendant on duty until 4 a.m., and he parks on the second floor near the attendant booth, and he said he knows that probably doesn't matter if something genuinely wanted to get to him, but it makes him feel better, and feeling better is something. He said he still thinks about the voice, the steady, uninterrupted quality of it, someone talking in a dark stairwell at 2:30 a.m. with no apparent listener. He said some conversations, he thinks, aren't meant to be heard. He said he heard part of one. He said he's grateful, that's all he heard. Story 3, the apartment hallway. This is the last story, and it's the one I've thought about the most since receiving it. It comes from a woman I'll call Carrie. She's in her early 30s, lives in New York City, and what she described happened in the building where she lived, not on the street, not in transit, not in a public space. In her own building. In the hallway outside her own apartment. I want to establish some context. Carrie lived in a 6-story walk-up in Brooklyn, the kind of building that's been there since the 1920s and has the specific character of a building that has housed hundreds of people over a century. Narrow staircase, long hallways on each floor, the building sounds that old buildings have, pipes, settling, the specific acoustics of a space where sound travels in unexpected ways. 24 units total. She'd lived there for 2 years and knew most of her neighbors by sight and several by name. She said it was a good building. Safe building, she'd always felt. She'd never had any reason to feel otherwise. She worked from home as a freelance writer and kept irregular hours, sometimes up late, sometimes working through the night when a deadline demanded it. She said she was used to being awake in the building at 3 and 4 a.m. when the rest of it was quiet. She knew what the building sounded like at those hours. She knew its rhythms the way you know the rhythms of any place you spend a lot of time in. She said what she heard on the night this happened was not a rhythm she recognized. It was a Thursday in March. She'd been working late past 3 a.m., finishing an article. The building was quiet the way it always was at that hour. She was at her desk in the living room, the apartment silent except for her typing. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. She said this was not unusual in itself. People came home late. People got up to deal with children. Footsteps in a hallway at 3 a.m. were not alarming in a building with 24 units. She said the reason these footsteps were different was their pattern. They were slow, slower than normal walking, the pace of someone moving very deliberately, placing each step carefully, and they were moving in a way she couldn't immediately make sense of back and forth, not down the hall toward the stairs or the elevator, back and forth, a short distance, repeated, like packing, a slow, deliberate packing in the hallway directly outside her door. She said she stopped typing and listened. The packing continued. Back and forth, unhurried, in the narrow range that she estimated covered the few feet in front of her apartment. She said she looked at her door. She had a standard apartment door with a deadbolt and a chain lock, both of which were engaged. She had a peephole. She said she sat at her desk for about 2 minutes listening to the packing before she got up and went to the peephole. She said she stood in front of the door for a moment before she looked. She said she doesn't know why she hesitated, just something about putting her eye to that small circle of glass, while someone was on the other side of the door. Even a door with a deadbolt and a chain felt like a decision she needed to prepare for. She looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Not a figure walking away, not someone just exiting the frame of the peephole's fisheye view. Empty. The hallway visible through the peephole, which covered most of the hall width and a decent stretch in both directions, was empty. She stood at the door and listened. No footsteps. She waited 30 seconds, nothing, silence. She went back to her desk. She sat down. She picked up where she'd left off. 3 minutes later, the footsteps started again. Same pace, same pattern, slow back and forth right outside her door. She went back to the peephole. Empty hallway. She stood at the door this time and listened without looking away. The footsteps continued. She was standing at the door and the footsteps were on the other side of it, and the peephole showed an empty hallway, and she was listening to footsteps in an empty hallway. She said that was when she felt the fear, not before. Not when she first heard them, not when the peephole showed nothing. When she was standing at the door listening to footsteps in an empty space, that was the moment it hit her. She stepped back from the door. She said she stood in her apartment at 3 a.m., and the footsteps continued for another few minutes and then stopped. She stood there for a long time after they stopped before she went back to her desk. She didn't do any more work that night. She sat at her desk with the desk lamp on and waited for it to be light outside. She said she asked her neighbors about it the next day. Casually, did anyone have trouble sleeping? Did anyone hear anything in the hallway last night? She said she asked 3 or 4 of the neighbors she knew best. One of them, a man who lived directly across the hall from her, she called him Pete, said something that stopped her. He said he hadn't heard anything last night, but he asked why she was asking. She said she'd heard something in the hallway late. He said how late. She said around 3 a.m. He said he'd had something similar about a month ago. He said he'd heard what sounded like someone moving in the hall very slowly and late, and when he'd looked through his peephole, he'd seen nothing. She said she looked at him for a moment. Then she asked if it had happened more than once. He said twice. Same pattern both times. Slow movement outside his door, nothing visible when he looked. She said they stood in the hallway and looked at each other, and neither of them said the obvious thing for a moment. Then Pete said that old buildings have strange acoustics. Sound travels in ways that don't make intuitive sense. He said footsteps from another floor could sound like they were right outside your door. He said there were probably explanations. She said she agreed with him out loud. She said she's not sure she agreed with him internally. Because she said the footsteps hadn't sounded distant or filtered the way sound does when it travels through floors or walls. They'd sounded immediate, present, the specific acoustic quality of sound in the same space as you rather than sound arriving from somewhere else. She said she thought about it differently after talking to Pete. She thought about the fact that it had happened to both of them. Not in the same night. Pete's experiences had been a month earlier, but the same hallway, the same hours, the same pattern. Something had been packing that hallway for at least a month. She moved out 4 months later. She said the lease was up and she chose not to renew rather than specifically moving because of this. She said she didn't want to make too much of it. She'd heard footsteps twice. The peephole had shown nothing. Pete had heard something similar. That was it. That was all she had. She said the reason she sent it to me is what happened the week before she moved out. She was doing a final walkthrough of the apartment, checking the closets and the cabinets, making sure she hadn't left anything. She opened the coat closet near the front door. She'd mostly emptied it already and looked at the top shelf. There was a small mark on the wall at the back of the coat closet. She'd never noticed it before, or it had always been there and she'd looked past it. She stood on her toes and looked more closely. It was a series of small marks, scratched into the plaster. She said they looked like tally marks, the kind you make in groups of 5, 4 vertical lines and 1 diagonal. She counted them. She said she's counted them multiple times in her memory since, and she's confident in the number. 31 tally marks, scratched into the back wall of her coat closet. She stood there looking at them for a long time. Then she thought about who had lived in the apartment before her. She'd moved in when the previous tenant moved out. The landlord had mentioned in passing, at some point, that the previous tenant had lived there for just over 2 years. She said she thought about 2 years of living in an apartment, hearing something slow and deliberate in the hallway outside your door at 3 a.m., looking through the peephole and seeing nothing, and making a mark. 31 times. She said she thought about what it meant, that she'd only heard it twice in 2 years. She thought about what it meant that the previous tenant had apparently heard it 31 times. She thought about whether the frequency had been increasing over time, or whether the previous tenant had simply been more attuned to it, whether they'd moved out because of it. She said she thought about leaving her own mark next to the 31. She said she decided not to. She said she didn't want to add to the record. She didn't want to make herself part of whatever that wall was tracking. She didn't want whatever was packing that hallway at 3 a.m. to have her counted alongside everyone else who had stood at that door and listened and looked and found nothing. She said she left the closet and finished the walkthrough and handed in her keys. She said she hopes the next tenant doesn't look in the coat closet. She said she hopes if they do look, they have the same instinct she had. She said she hopes they don't add a mark. She said 31 is enough. Those are the 3 stories. Nina in Chicago, Derek in Los Angeles, Carrie in New York. A train, a parking structure, a hallway. What I keep coming back to is the city's specific relationship with anonymity. The city is where you can be surrounded by millions of people and completely alone, where the person next to you on the train is a stranger and will remain one, where the voice in the stairwell belongs to nobody you'll ever identify, where whatever paces the hallway at 3 a.m. is separated from you by a door and a deadbolt and 31 marks on a closet wall. The city is supposed to be safer than the dark road and the empty forest because there are people everywhere, because density means witnesses, because you're never truly alone. Nina knows how fast alone happens on the last train of the night. Derek knows what a voice in an empty stairwell sounds like when it stops. Carrie knows that 31 marks on a wall represent 31 times. Someone stood at a door and listened, and looked and found nothing and went back to bed, and got up the next morning and thought about whether to leave. She said 31 is enough. I keep thinking about what enough means in that sentence. Enough marks, enough times, enough of whatever was on the other side of that door. Enough to leave.